This presentation is made possible by the generous support of Avenue Hotel Bed and Breakfast, the getaway that isn't far away. Colorado Life Magazine, the magazine that explores Colorado. The Gilpin Historical Society, more than just the face. Sarah Britton Jack of Sarah B. Jack and Associates, Political and Government Relations. The National Mining Hall of Fame and Museum. And by State Representative Bob Gardner, House District 20.
This was a place where people came for dreams.
The legendary frontier town of Leadville is a destination to visitors from all over the world. A high mountain valley nestled amid snow-capped peaks, Leadville is the nation's highest incorporated city at 10,200 feet. In 1860, Abe Lee discovered gold in an area in the extreme western territory of Kansas called California Gulch. This placer gold, as it was called, was found above ground in gravel deposits. Word spread quickly, and soon prospectors from all over the country were headed up to this new El Dorado. The gold rush brought in thousands of wealth seekers to the camp, which later became known as Oro City. One such man was Horace Austin Warner Tabor.
Whether we like it or not, our past is still our present and our future. Right. Because the people who came here 100 years ago, 120 years ago, 130 years ago, came here with a dream. And they've clung to that through depressions, through booms. One minute we're mining gold because that's what the country wants. Well, I don't want that anymore. I want silver. Well, we'll mine that. Then, of course, for all those years, from the end of World War I almost until 1985, huge span of time, there was molybdenum at the Climax mine. Mm-hmm. It was never going to end, and there's still ore up in these hills, but there's just no market for it. There's no way to refine it.
We've stumbled across some things from H.A.W. Tabor, and it ties back to Leadville.
Oh, yes.
And that's what we want to find out is we want to know the history behind it, because we're finding buildings in Buckskin Joe. Mm-hmm. We're finding the fact that Mr. Tabor started the first investment into the old mining town of Whitehorn, Colorado. And then up here in Leadville, and it ties to the original Buckskin Joe over by Alma. Mm-hmm. And we want to know the history behind the Tabor family, how he came to be, how long they were there at the height of their richness, I guess is for a better word, and then what happened to them, and then how come we have two different Mrs. Tabors?
It's a fascinating story when you consider that the Tabor story takes up 105 years. He was born in 1830, and the second Mrs. Tabor died in 1935. So it's 105 years, and it spans from Maine to California. He was born in Vermont in 1830, and Vermont was the first state in the country to abolish slavery. Because of that, he had a strong abolitionist background, and that's what led him eventually to Kansas. Because at that time, Kansas was going to be admitted to the Union sometime, mm-hmm. and the concern was it going to be a free state or a slave state? And because he was an abolitionist and very politically minded, he decided to try his luck out there to be a homesteader for 160 acres if you could survive. Then he went back to Maine and married Miss Pierce, who was the third daughter of a man who he worked for in the stone quarry in Augusta, Maine. She was named after her hometown. Oh, okay. Augusta Louise Pierce. She was 5'6" and very frail. They were surprised that she lived this long. And when she met Mr. Tabor, she was 20 and he was 23. And he was 6 feet tall and weighed 180 pounds, which was large for those
days. Pretty good sized guy.
And in good shape, too, because of his stone quarry work. Mm-hmm. He had a bad habit, though. He liked to drink and talk politics and fight. So if they were to have a future together, young Miss Pierce made Mr. Tabor promise he'd not do that anymore. So he kept his promise, at least while he knew she was around. And eventually they got married and went to Kansas. Their son was born 3 weeks premature. to a very unhealthy young lady. And between their work on the farm, they spent a couple years there while he dabbled in the Kansas legislature. And then the rumors of gold being discovered near Pikes Peak in the western part of Kansas Territory attracted him.
Soon news of the gold rush reached the Tabors, and in May of 1860, they packed up their meager belongings and set a course for California Gulch. The long, difficult journey took 6 weeks, and the fact that their baby son Maxie was very sickly made it even harder.
He suggested she go back to Maine, and she said, "No, I'm with you for better, for worse." So you can imagine, before interstates, before railroads, before any of that, here's this lady traveling with her husband for about 13, 14 months, up and down the front range of Colorado, into the mountain areas, eventually over the pass that they create with the wagon train, up the Arkansas River Valley, and eventually they come to Leadville, to Oro City actually, the predecessor to Leadville, in May of 1860 with those first 10,000 people.
Upon arriving at the rugged mining camp, Augusta immediately made herself available for cooking, sewing, laundry, and anything else she could do to help the men out.
All this time, this was a lady who had tremendous education and had to learn how to cook in Kansas. So she spent a good deal of her time cooking and baking and sewing and making soap and nursing a rather unhealthy child, taking care of miners, wherever they happened to be. She was always there to provide services for the miners as far as health and well-being, that kind of thing.
Horace kept busy prospecting, running a small general store, and dabbling in politics.
He prospected, and prospected not only for gold, but for votes, because he was the political man.
Mining was not an easy way of life. Along with the obvious hardships of long hours, no money, and little food, one thing that particularly irritated the prospectors about this mountain terrain was the veins of lead carbonate that were found in abundance. It seemed wherever the men searched for gold, one of these veins would become an obstacle and hinder their progress. But they would eventually find their way around it and uncover a little more gold to keep them interested. Soon the supply of placer gold was depleted, and the once profitable mining camp was deserted. Not to be deterred, Horace and Augusta left Oro City and set out for another spot with the promise of gold, the town of Buckskin Joe.
They decided to go across the mountain to Buckskin Joe, the one near Alma.
Right,
the original
town.
And they stayed there for quite a while, about 7 years, and built a bigger store and so forth, but the gold played out there too.
Okay.
And here they are back in Oro City, back in California Gulch. And eventually they set up a bigger store. By this time the son is old enough to help. They have a couple of relatives of hers who come out here, and they help in the store, and things look like they're going very well in 1875, 1876.
In 1877, a momentous discovery was made. Those pesky veins of lead carbonate that so irritated the placer gold prospectors earlier contained rich silver ore. This was the beginning of the silver boom.
That year there was a big announcement that there was a silver discovery around the hill from where the gold had been found. And so Oro City became kind of impractical to live in, because that meant you'd have to go around the hill and up the hill to get to work. So they began to make a settlement here where we are presently, but it didn't have a name yet.
Oro City was officially organized and appointed Leadville, named for the plentiful carbonate of lead native to the area.
This district is known for gold and silver, zinc, and lead. Those are the main ones, as well as pyrite. There's lots of pyrite here. The other thing that Leadville is famous for is molybdenum. The molybdenum is in a different district. It is a very historic district. The mining went on. The last mine actually closed in late 1990s, so it did have quite a long-lived period. But the main bulk of the mining actually happened at the end of the 19th century. The heyday was the 1870s and the 1880s for this mining district.
We'd kiss our wives and sweethearts and gobble goober peas. Peas, peas, peas.
By 1880, the mining camp was producing so much silver, A more efficient way to transport the ore was desperately needed. A joint trackage agreement brought in the Denver and Rio Grande and the Denver, South Park, and Pacific narrow-gauge railroads, which allowed thousands of pounds of ore to be moved, not only around the mining district, but throughout the state as well. Before the railroad, the only way to and from Leadville was a long, uncomfortable journey by stagecoach. The unencumbered route opened up a whole new world in transporting mining supplies, coal for fuel, building materials, and various merchandise. It also opened up a new way for people to travel in comfort, so passengers flocked to nearby depots to try out this new, luxurious means of transportation. Leadville is a little town with a big history. So to say that it was just a mining town would be a gross understatement. Leadville was home to people from all over the world, from the very rich to the decidedly destitute. Fortunes were made there by the likes of J.J. and Molly Brown and the Guggenheims. A brilliant businessman, Horace Tabor also made his fortune in silver, though this man's rags to riches story didn't have a happy ending. Upon the discovery of silver, Tabor, a shopkeeper from Kansas, grub-staked a couple of miners who struck it rich at the Little Pittsburgh mine and became an overnight millionaire. This was the first of his so-called bonanza mines, and soon Horace Tabor became known as the Bonanza King of Leadville. He eventually sold his interest in Little Pittsburgh and purchased what is now the most famous mine in the country, the Matchless. Named after Jacob Pincus, famous horse racing jockey. He was named the Matchless Jew for his unmatchable winning record.
We are standing in the East Side Mining District in Leadville, Colorado. The district encompasses quite a few square miles of mining properties. It is historic. Gold was discovered here in 1859 in California Gulch. The gold period lasted until the end of the 1860s when silver was discovered in the early 1870s.
In 1885, in February, the citizens of Leadville were horrified to hear about and read about an avalanche that claimed 8 lives at the Homestake Mine northwest of the city. They were so troubled by this event, and they had known these men so well, that they all contributed and donated this monument to commemorate their comrades who had lost their lives in a natural accident not connected with mining, but with just Mother Nature herself. The interesting thing about this monument is that it's metal. There are 3 metal monuments in the cemetery, and this one happens to be the best preserved, particularly when you notice the inscriptions are clear, and even the smaller headstones that mark the individual graves that have the initials of the people who are buried here are also metal. They have granite bases, and the border around the monument is granite. So this was a substantial contribution to the memory of these fellows who worked hard, just like thousands of other men did, in the mining industry in inhospitable conditions high up in the Rocky Mountains near Leadville, Colorado.
It's important to remind people of our mineral resources and the story of where they've come from and how they have evolved from early mining to today's mining, and how important it really is.
And between 1876 and 1878, when Leadville was incorporated, that's when Mr. Tabor built this home for his wife. It's the only home of all the places that they lived that is still standing. And it's important to understand that they were married for 20 years before she had this little modest home.
In just 2 short years, Tabor founded 2 newspapers, a bank, and was elected to mayor of this thriving new city in the Rockies.
But the Tabors were a force to be reckoned with here. Mrs. Tabor, who is behind me on the left there, she looks like a strong-willed woman. And that strength, I assure you, comes from inside, not from the physical body, because she never really was healthy. But she was Leadville's first lady because he was the mayor, and she kept that title till she died because everybody loved her here, especially from the old days because she was generous. But she did her work mostly through charities and churches. She wanted to make sure that children had Christmas presents. She wanted to make sure that people without homes had a place to live.
Leadville boasted a thriving red light district, even though prostitution wasn't exactly legal. It also had a great many saloons, which led Tabor to believe his town needed a bit of refinement.
Right now we're on the stage of the historic Tabor Opera House that was built by Horace Tabor, Silver King, and it was built when he was still married to Augusta Tabor, and there was great need for a place of entertainment where families could gather. There were other opera houses, but they were more like saloons, and so there were gunfights and brawling, and the ladies couldn't get dressed up like they were used to doing in the East, and they couldn't bring their families. So when this was built, then it was a place where they could come and enjoy the best of entertainment and bring their whole family. This building has an Italianate design, and it's made of Portland cement, iron, and brick. The interior walls are 18 inches thick and solid brick. So you know how well built the building was. And to realize that all went up in 100 days is just amazing.
Opening night was not without its problems, however. The hanging of two outlaws that morning dampened the spirits of theater-goers. So many of the plush Andrews Patton opera chairs were empty. But the show, A Serious Family, along with a comedy called Who's Who, debuted as scheduled, and the Tabor Opera House became the place to see and be seen from then on.
Probably the one that most people recognize the most would be Houdini, and he used this trapdoor right here. So did Thurston the Great. John Philip Sousa was here. Buffalo Bill was here. And Otis Skinner, he played Hamlet here.
Tabor was a rising star. It seemed everything he touched turned to gold, or silver. With the Matchless bringing in $10,000 a day, he purchased a 20-room mansion in Denver.
Eventually, the city of Leadville grew too small for Horace Tabor, and so did this house, because once he was the benefactor of the little Pittsburgh mine that made him millions over time, he just managed to fulfill his political ambitions. Now he had the money.
The Tabors lived a charmed life that anyone would relish in. But despite all the wealth, fame, and stylish affairs, the one person who didn't really fit in was Augusta.
She was dragged to Denver to live in the mansion because she didn't want to leave here.
Okay.
She thought for all the world that she would be living in this house the rest of her life. And when he took her to Denver, she really didn't like living there. There are stories that she lived in the servants' quarters rather than the fancy quarters upstairs, and that she kept a milk cow on the lawn and milked it. She kept to her old country ways, pretty much, even though she had money.
Kind of down to earth.
Oh, yeah.
Augusta thought they should save for the future, but Horace Tabor was a big spender, and none of this frugality set well with him. He was a wealthy man and believed everything about him should reflect his bank account, including his wife.
Before, he was a politician, and he could get by on being appointed postmaster and that sort of thing. But once he had the money, then he could play politics with it, and he threw bucketfuls of money at the Republican Party to angle for offices and so forth. And so he was a force in early Colorado politics.
What caused the divorce between Augusta and Horace?
Well, personalities for one thing. He was this outgoing, back-slapping, have a cigar and let's go have a drink and talk politics he was a social person. Mrs. Tabor wasn't. First of all, she wasn't healthy. She was frail. 20 years of doing what she did on the plains in Kansas and in the mining camps was taking its toll on her. And besides, her personality was New England. Her personality was, let's go to church and let's read our Bibles and let's read good literature and let's stay home, and we'll receive visitors occasionally, especially on January 1st of every year for New Year's, and we'll observe a traditional, quiet way of life. Well, two opposites.
Kind of grew apart.
Sure, sure.
In 1879, Tabor was elected Lieutenant Governor of Colorado. With the duties of the state's office and his many business interests, Horace was traveling more. This forged a wedge between the couple, and they grew increasingly apart. One of his favorite places was Central City, where he could mingle with people equal to his own social stature. It was there that he met the woman who would become the third piece in the most scandalous love triangle of the 19th century.
He had business interests in Central City, and Mr. Tabor's older brother, John, lived in Central City. So it's not unlikely that Mr. Tabor would have gone over there to visit, do some business, and monkey business.
Central City was a bustling mining town in the 1860s, so it was commonplace to see the mining moguls walking on the same streets as the miners they employed. There was something for everyone, from saloons and brothels for the hard-working miners seeking recreation, to the brand-new opera house where the upper crust could enjoy themselves and mingle with their own kind. Self-made millionaires like Horace Tabor.
Mrs. Tabor knew what he was doing. Even while she lived here, she knew what he was doing, because he constructed a set of rooms, a suite of rooms for himself in the Tabor Opera House when he built it over here. Everybody knew what was going on, and of course the proper folks didn't say anything. The newspapers did, and accused him of being a Mormon because he had several wives here and there. Journalism is mild nowadays compared to what it used to be. If somebody had a target, man, and you had some newsprint.
We've noticed that going through old newspapers and the archives, researching things, there are some vendettas.
No kidding.
Unbelievable.
Elizabeth Banjul McCourt was born in 1854 to a prosperous Oshkosh, Wisconsin family. Her father, Peter McCourt, was a prominent clothier and benefactor of Oshkosh's Grand Opera House. Her nickname was Lizzie, but her older brother affectionately called her Baby. By the age of 16, she was named the Belle of Oshkosh and was pursued by many young men. But the one who caught her eye was a man by the name of Baby Doe. The couple married in 1877 and moved to Central City, where Harvey's father had ownership in a mining property. Harvey, it turns out, was not the best provider, even though he was literally handed the job in the mine. He was a lazy procrastinator who drifted from job to job and town to town, which inevitably led to financial and marital problems.
The Doe family was pretty prominent back in Oshkosh, and they had a mine out in Central City called the 4th of July mine. And so everyone thought, as they did in those days, that if you have a mine, you're automatically rich. So just go out and dig a few holes and you'll find it and everything will be fine. And so Harvey, who was rather a mama's boy, really didn't like the West, but he came out here anyway. And he and his wife set up housekeeping in Denver for a while, and then they moved up to Central City to work the mine.
The women of Central City didn't at all care for the beautiful Baby Doe.
Mrs. Doe walked around Central City and was very attractive, and so she attracted a lot of people.
She was very self-assured for a woman of her time. Even a little brazen, one might say. But Baby Doe paid the women no mind. She was a free spirit, and was never content with playing by the rules.
Harvey did less working of the mine than talking about it. He spent a lot of time talking about how he was going to make money and all of this, and eventually found his way into the taverns and the pool halls, and fell into what the newspapers called dissipated habits. And eventually he was supposedly caught with a woman not his wife by his own wife, and that led to the eventual end of
that's
marriage.
what that was.
That's the rumor.
During their separation, Harvey went back to his mother in Oshkosh, and despite attempts to save her marriage, Lizzie and Harvey would eventually divorce in 1880, citing infidelity against her husband. After divorcing Harvey, Baby Doe, as she was known in her early days in Central City, found solace in a good-looking Central City clothing store proprietor named Jacob Sandalowski. Although, like many immigrants, Jacob changed his last name to something a little simpler, Sands. He was strikingly handsome, with dark curly hair and bright blue eyes. Jake was a good friend to Baby Doe. He helped out with her expenses and was always there for her. In fact, some wonder just how close the two actually were. In July of 1879, while Harvey was back in Oshkosh, Baby Doe gave birth to a stillborn son. The infant had dark, curly hair and piercing blue eyes. Mrs. Doe claimed that Harvey Doe was the father, but there are those who find it strange that Sands paid for all the medical expenses as well as the funeral of the child. No one ever knew much about the incident, and the only clue Baby Doe left was a handwritten note in her scrapbook. With dried flowers placed carefully around it, it simply said, "My baby boy, born July 13th, 1879, had dark hair, very curly, large blue eyes. He was lovely." There were also intimate notes found in her scrapbook after her death, from Jake. One declared, "My darling love, I remain yours and ever, Jake." A portion of another said, "Hope to hear from you by return mail. I remain yours and ever, Jake."
Jacob Sands and Baby Doe had a little affair going on. We started delving into this and finding out the documentation about where he was and what years. We ended up finding all the history about Jacob.
Well, his family came to New York from Poland when Jake was 16. He was born on Christmas Day in 1861. And his family emigrated over here and almost immediately became involved in the clothing trade.
It was clear, even at that time, that Baby Doe was very much at ease around Colorado's elite, and she inevitably caught the eye of Leadville's Bonanza King, who was immediately taken by this young beauty. With her creamy white complexion and strawberry blonde hair, she just seemed to light up the room.
The conventional wisdom is that they met here, and it was an arranged meeting, but there's nothing to say that he hadn't known her before in Central City. And you would think it would be one of those, I'll bat my eyes at you across the dining room and we'll meet and we'll have a great torrid affair or get married, whatever it is, for a while, and then it'll be over. But that certainly wasn't the case. They loved each other. Mm-hmm. He certainly wrote her letters all about missing her when he was on political trips and so forth, and wanted to be, and they're quite spicy. They really are, for something that this Mrs. Tabor would certainly not have written or read.
So they were night and day from each other.
Mm-hmm.
Tabor was captivated by his new love and almost immediately put her up in an elegant suite at the luxurious Windsor Hotel in Denver. It soon became obvious that there was a torrid affair going on between the two, and Horace went to Augusta for a divorce, which she promptly refused to give him. Not to be denied, Horace set up a quick divorce in Durango, and he and Baby Doe were secretly married in St. Louis on September 13th, 1882. Once Augusta found out about the marriage, it was too late to contest it, and she reluctantly gave in, but not without a fight. After a long, nasty court battle, the former Mrs. Tabor ended up with $100,000 a month, the mansion in Denver, and a few other properties. After finally receiving the legal divorce he so desperately wanted, and finishing up an interim 30-day senatorial appointment, a legal and public wedding was planned in Washington, D.C. It was a lavish affair, to be sure. The bride's gown cost $7,000, and the wedding gift from her groom, a $90,000 diamond necklace. All of Tabor's congressional friends from Washington were there, including the president, Chester A. Arthur. But as elaborate as the occasion was, none of the wives, not even the First Lady, attended such a disgraceful event. It was front-page news all over the country and an embarrassment to Washington and other public figures in high positions. And to add insult to injury, everyone thought the new Mrs. Tabor a gold digger. They were sure she would leave Horace without thinking twice.
Everybody thought that the money was going to run out, and so would the second wife. But that, of course, isn't the case. The wife stays with him.
The first 10 years of married life for the Tabors were bliss. They moved to Denver. The mines were all producing. Horace had built his wife a block-long mansion. And being the generous man he was, Horace gave the city of Denver what Leadville already had, the Tabor Grand Opera House. With the exception of being shunned by polite Denver society, life was seemingly perfect for the Tabors. Baby Doe gave birth to 2 children, both girls, Elizabeth Banjul Lily in 1884 and Rosemary Echo Silver Dollar in 1889.
Silver Dollar came from William Jennings Bryan. She was born at the end of this this empire, you might say, in the early 90s, and this was when the question of, is the country going to be based on gold or silver in terms of its money? And so that's why William Jennings Bryan, even though he's a Democrat, is the hero of the silver miners in the West, who are mostly Republicans, because he will keep the U.S. on the gold and silver standard. When he visited the Tabors in Denver, he heard this young child crying, and he said, her voice sounds like the ring of a silver dollar. So Horace Tabor, being the jovial fellow he was, let's add that to the certificate, Rosemary Echo Honeymaid Silver Dollar. Life was perfect. Then, in 1893, their charmed life came to an abrupt end. In 1893, the repeal of the Sherman Silver Purchase Act threw the country into a tailspin, but nowhere was it more apparent than Colorado, producing nearly 60% of the nation's silver. With the price of silver dropping from 83 to 62 cents an ounce in 4 days, mines and smelters began shutting down almost immediately. Banks closed their doors and real estate values plummeted. And then it was gone. The mansions, the opulent affairs, the furs, the jewels, life, as the Tabors knew it, was gone. Now 65, Horace and his family left the mansion and moved into a rented cottage. They moved from the mansion, which by this time the electricity and the gas and the utilities had been cut off of this huge mansion.
Okay.
And they were lighting it by candles. And eventually they get evicted, and he leaves the mansion with 2 suitcases and what is on his back. They moved here and there. They moved to a smaller house in Denver, and then in a small suite of rooms, ultimately at the Windsor Hotel. The character thing about him is he is not, he doesn't blame anybody. He's not bitter. He figures the Tabor luck will come back. He puts what is left of his fortune into a mine in Arizona, the Vulture, thinking that it would come back. He has a mine in Boulder County called the Eclipse that he works himself once he can't pay the help. And in 1897, 2 years before he died, he is 67, which is not young in those days. He is in Chihuahua, Mexico, prospecting.
Wow, now see, I've never heard this story.
Yeah, he's in Chihuahua, Mexico, and in my private collection I have a letter that his attorney is writing to some creditors saying, Mr. Tabor's in Chihuahua, and I know you understand that the children have been ill with typhoid or some awful disease, so please can you hold off a little bit. And it's written on Tabor Grand Opera House stationery that's been crossed out.
Oh man, that's got to have been hard for him to do.
It was. And that's what's so sad, is because she offered him money when he was in his last years. In fact, she died on what would have been the eve of their 38th wedding anniversary in California. And So at the same time, there he was trying to mortgage this to pay for that, and all the house of cards was beginning to totter.
Horace Austin Warner Tabor died from appendicitis on April 10, 1899. He'd been serving as the postmaster of Denver since the previous year.
Well, and even before he got to be postmaster, the last real job he worked at was a smelter man up here in Leadville for $3 a day.
Oh boy.
Mm-hmm. So the curtain at the Tabor Grand Opera House has this well-known bit of poetry. So fleet the works of men back to the earth again. Ancient and holy things fade like a dream. And how prophetic that was when he commissioned that curtain to be painted. You know, so fleet the works of men.
His
there
life.
he was. Yeah.
Wow.
And then, of course, when he died, Mrs. Tabor took the children and eventually moved from one place to another. They have several addresses in Denver. They spend a little bit of time in New York, although I can't figure out why. But they come eventually back to Leadville and live in several different places here until at last they make it up to the Matchless mine and move into a tool shed, really. Very often that's referred to as Baby Doe's cabin.
Right.
And we get the impression in our mind, especially if you're not used to the story, that it's a nice little lodge in the woods. Well,
yeah, we were
by a
just
lake
there.
with ducks. No.
It's tiny.
Well, and it's rustic. It was a place to store drills and hammers, and it wasn't, it's like a shed you'd have in your garden. It wasn't a place to watch television and go to sleep. You know, this was a shed, a storage shed, and she did the best she could to make curtains and insulated the place with newspapers and so forth, and tried to make a home for these two children.
The two Tabor girls did not share the same optimism for the mine as their mother. Baby Doe had always believed that the Matchless mine would produce again, but the sisters both went their separate ways. Lily, 17, left first. She went to Baby Doe's home state of Wisconsin and eventually married her first cousin, the son of Baby Doe's late sister, Cornelia. The couple had 2 children. Silver Dollar stayed with her mother only slightly longer than Lily.
One of the things that Mrs. Tabor was not fond of doing at all was accepting charity of any kind. And folks could leave a basket of food or coal or wood at the door of that cabin, and the food would rot before she would go out and get it. Unless she went through the ritual of doing an IOU for people who might lend her money or something like that. When I was a small boy, I would visit with my grandparents to other people's homes and so forth, and I would see on the wall of almost every dining room, I promised to pay so-and-so $5, Mrs. H.A.W. Tabor, and that was one of the ways that she would accept charity. The other way would be to lease the mine. Now, this is a mine that hadn't really produced anything for years.
Now we're talking about the Pittsburgh?
Now we're talking about the Matchless, where she
Matchless,
lived.
okay.
The story is that Mr. Tabor's last words to her were, "Hang on to the Matchless, it will make millions."
Oh, so that's not a true statement then?
No, he never said that. Even though Mrs. Tabor was let on the property to sort of give her a place to live in the early years, and then she was a good caretaker. There was somebody at least up there. And Peter McCourt made sure that the bills were paid for her and so forth.
So she was kind of renting the property, living in a place that she didn't own anymore either.
No, and all of this was done to just keep her going.
Kind of like the first Mrs. Tabor.
In her own sort of way. Well, the second Mrs. Tabor, remember, was without assets at all.
Oh,
you know,
okay.
She was broke.
But here she's back in a place that used to be hers and now it's not anymore.
That's right. The other thing that you could do is lease the mine. And very often there'd be this ritual where if you wanted to give her a large sum of money, you went to see the attorney who handled her affairs, who was a friend of our family's. And he himself told me this story about how very often people would say, well, winter's coming, we better see if Mrs. Tabor needs coal and so forth. So he would arrange for her to be down in town, and when she was in town, he would write up a lease from her for these people for the Matchless for work to begin in the spring.
Okay.
Nobody was ever going to go up there, but by the time spring came, they would have seen her through the winter with the coal that they would have bought her with the money. But she wouldn't take any of it without leasing the mine. So she came in one day and did this thing for that. And he was about ready to tear, in fact, he was tearing up the lease and throwing it away when she came back in the office because she forgot her gloves on his desk.
Uh-oh.
And she saw him with it, and he very quickly, "Oh, Mrs. Tabor, so glad to have you back. I made a mistake on the first lease, so I'm glad you're here. We can sign a second." Yeah. Because that was the only way you could get the poor lady to accept anything.
So she was leasing a property she didn't own then.
But in her mind,
she owned it.
Mm-hmm.
For 35 years, the woman known to all as Baby Doe Tabor held a lonely vigil in the tiny one-room shack, eating her rationed food and in the harsh Colorado winter, keeping herself warm with the only source of heat she had. She owned a winter coat and wore a thin layer of burlap over her shoes in an attempt to keep out the cold and snow. A devout Catholic, Baby Doe walked the 1-mile trip to town once a week to attend the Church of the Annunciation, always slipping silently into the last pew. Becoming a recluse over the years, Baby Doe allowed only a certain select few into her home.
There's a very well-known photograph of her, which is probably the last one taken of her.
Okay.
At the doorway of the cabin, there's a man standing next to her. His name's Dick Wilmoth. He was a powder salesman, explosives powder.
Okay.
And he got her to come out of the cabin because she was not friendly. And the photograph is of her, and he wasn't a very big man. He was about 5'8" or 9. And she's much shorter than he is. And she's got her arm in his, and she's got this skeletal hand that's holding a handkerchief and some keys. And that's not as important as that face. You look at that face.
I've seen that face, and it looks like she's not there.
It will haunt you, that face.
It does.
Yeah. She wrote constantly about her impressions and dreams and that reminiscences and all that sort of thing.
Well, Baby Doe was wonderful in that she wrote on anything. I don't care if it was a scrap of a grocery bag or a napkin.
The one that gets to be the most is the one short little entry, "A bluebird was my only company today."
That's kind of spooky.
Yeah. Now, I encourage anybody who goes up to the Matchless mine, when you get out of your car and turn it off, no matter what the guides rush up to you and try to tell you, or whatever anybody else, just listen to the quiet. And imagine what she went through season after season, year after year.
It had to have been deafening.
Of that. That's right. That's right.
She was wonderful in recording just even her day-to-day life. And one of those things, of course, was a calendar. And when we got to do even more research, we found out that she took a page in 1915, February. And when we started looking at it a little closer, she had her code name for her daughter Silver on it. And on the top it says the 20th baby Silver. And then she circled the 20th and even put at 9:30 a.m. a baby girl. Did Silver have a baby? Well, we do know that Silver was in Colorado Springs filming with the Colorado Springs Film Company, filming a movie called The Great Barrier. So yeah, she would have been in Colorado Springs. Then it goes on to give us little details about a loan that Baby Doe had to pay for this of $1,115. So is it possible Silver had a baby in Colorado Springs?
I can just imagine her walking these streets, thinking of what was.
Stories over the years paint the second Mrs. Tabor as having cabin fever, driving her to lose her mind toward the end, forgetting to stoke the fire in the stove. It's said she froze to death. We uncovered a different story.
There are several things about this cemetery that are mirrors of the human condition, about poverty and wealth and about how people's fortunes change. And I'm often asked about the Tabor story. Unfortunately, none of the Tabor family is buried in Leadville. They are in various locations around the country, most of them being in Denver. I do, however, have the privilege of keeping the birth and death certificates for Lake County, Colorado. And I have been asked to examine the death certificate of Elizabeth Tabor, who was more commonly known as Baby Doe, in order to finally set the record straight as to what her official cause of death was. I examined that this morning and can relate to you that the official cause of death was acute myocarditis. And for those of you who are not medical folks, myocarditis is defined as an inflammation of the heart muscle which can be brought on suddenly by a viral infection, and it leads usually to heart failure. That was Mrs. Tabor's cause of death, not frostbite, not freezing, not hypothermia, or any of the things you might write or read in the newspapers or books written about the situation. Mrs. Tabor died of heart failure.
We'd like to introduce you to Bob Herzl. He's the director of the National Mining Museum here in Leadville. Bob, appreciate you having us up here in Leadville and seeing what's around. Can you tell us where we're at right now and a little bit kind of the background behind this place?
Well, we're sitting in what's known as Baby Doe's cabin. It was either a supply cabin or a mine superintendent's cabin back when this mine was operating. When McCourt Tabor died in 1899, it was within about a year she moved up here, and she lived here until 1935. So yeah, she was here for 35 years. Interesting enough, Baby Doe passed away 75 years and 4 months ago in this cabin. I mean, she was on this floor. And a lot of people thought she froze to death, but she had a heart attack and then ended up on the floor and then froze as a result thereof. Okay. People didn't know that had happened until, as they would walk by on the road outside of the place here, they would always check the smokestack. And if there was smoke coming out, they knew Baby Doe had stoked up the stove and she was keeping warm. On that day, there was no smoke coming out of the stack.
Bob, can you tell us some of the items that are in here that are inside this old cabin where she's lived for so many years? I mean, do you know what's original, what's been recreated? I mean, what's the story behind what's in here?
I don't know that anything here is original. And the reason I say that, I mean, even that fur coat over there that we bought at an auction that we know that belonged to Baby Doe may not have been in here. Maybe she sold that at one time or another to raise some funds so she could make this a real mine.
But it did belong to her previous.
Yes, it did. The problem being is that when she passed away and they took her body away, people came in and just tore this place apart, literally tore this place apart, pulled up floorboards and ceiling and whatever, just looking for something that they thought maybe was of value that Baby Doe had kind of tucked away.
Maybe she had hidden some things.
And I'm certain certain artifacts that she had in here went as well. So I wouldn't doubt that some of this is original, but I couldn't validate that.
Okay, but we do have things in here that did belong to her.
Absolutely.
In her earlier life.
Absolutely.
I think the historical significance in saving a property like Elizabeth Tabor's cabin and the Matchless mine is that there's a lot of history here. This district, there are a lot of mine relics left, but this is one of the more complete ones still here, and it's accessible to the public. We do give public tours where people actually get to learn about the history of not only the Matchless and the Tabors, but also this entire district as a whole.
Mr. Tabor actually started the Denver Power Company. Before he passed, he never got to see the full company develop. But then later on, when Mrs. Tabor moved up here to Leadville, back into the cabin, Mr. Mullen came up here and was telling that they were bringing power into the property up here. And Elizabeth Tabor said, she said that nothing in this world is for free, so she did not want power in the cabin, so they decided to put the power into the hoist house.
On a cold March day in 1935, no smoke was rising from the little cabin on the hill. Elizabeth Banjul Tabor had died.
The Tabor story is fascinating because nobody wins, and especially the second Mrs. Tabor, who stayed with him through all of the good times, of course, and then all the bad times.
On the day Elizabeth Banjul McCourt was born, no one could have imagined the wealth, power, scandal, and anguish that would surround her life. Not even Baby Doe herself could predict how much her life would shape Colorado history.
Save me. Slowly rounding away from here to where I need to be. Will you be there? Or is it only me? I feel like screaming into the dark. Heaven's door. Will you be there? At heaven's door. Waiting me. Dream.
This presentation is made possible by the generous support of Avenue Hotel Bed and Breakfast, the getaway that isn't far away. Colorado Life magazine, the magazine that explores Colorado. The Gilpin Historical Society, more than just the face. Sarah Britton Jack of Sarah B. Jack and Associates, Political and Government Relations. The National Mining Hall of Fame and Museum. And by State Representative Bob Gardner, House District 20.